Hey there, we're going to continue with our second lecture of part 2 of endocrine, and we are going to be looking at the posterior pituitary hormones, and we'll also probably get into some of the other glands in the body in this lecture. All right, let's switch over to our notes. So we were at the bottom of page 22, the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, and actually that should be on the top of this page, so sorry about that. And there are two hormones that you need to worry about or to understand for this class, and that's oxytocin, OT, and antidiuretic hormone, ADH. So we're going to start with oxytocin. And you're going to notice right here, it's a little hard to see, I put it in right there, that this is our special case, our positive feedback mechanism. So write that in right now. This one is different than all the other ones, and the only hormone that's positive feedback that we talk about this term. So that's good. So this is, and the other thing about the pituitary gland, if you remember, is we don't use the portal system to get our hormones down to the pituitary anymore from the hypothalamus. Instead, they go down the tract, the HH tract. And this is because they're made in the hypothalamus and then they travel down the neurons and they are stored and then released in the posterior pituitary. We talked about that in previous lectures. So the first thing is, where is it produced? It's produced in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, right? And it's transported via the tract, all right? So neural stimuli, something from the brain stimulates it to go down to the posterior pituitary, and then that it's stored and released by the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So that's really important. Very different than using the releasing hormones that we saw before. Oxytocin is made up here, it's stored here, and it's released by the posterior pituitary when there's a stimulus. Okay, so what's the stimulus that we want to talk about here? The stimuli, the neural stimuli, let's type in neural, because all the other ones have been hormonal stimuli, right? These are neural stimuli. The neural stimuli that we see are these two. So we can have the cervix and the uterus stretch, and that sends the impulses to the paraventricular nucleus to release oxytocin. We can have suckling of the breast on the receptors in the nipple, and that will cause impulses to go to the paraventricular nucleus to release oxytocin. So if either of those two things are happening during childbirth or after childbirth during breastfeeding, we will cause oxytocin to go here and then eventually to release it. And the two places that oxytocin will interact are also the uterus and the breast. So the target cells are in the uterus and the breast. So the myometrial cells of the uterus, myometrial, so muscle, so these are the smooth muscle cells of the uterus that increase contractions during labor, delivery, and childbirth. And this is a positive feedback. So the more stimuli of oxytocin on these, the more contractions, and that will increase during the labor and delivery process. And only once the child is born do these impulses up here stop, because the uterus and cervix isn't stretched anymore, and then therefore we will not release oxytocin anymore. The other place is the epithelial cells of the breasts, which will actually cause contraction, and we get lactation or milk letdown, and this also uses a positive feedback. So the longer that the infant is suckling on the breast, more milk will be released in a positive feedback manner. So now remember, prolactin produced the milk, and if there's milk there, then oxytocin will cause the milk to be released and the child receive nourishment, right? So prolactin and oxytocin will work together to make the milk, produce the milk, and then release the milk, all right? So if you look up here, we don't really have anything that's directly going back like an inhibiting hormone. When the child is born, we aren't sending stimuli to the hypothalamus, and therefore OT is not being put in the posterior pituitary and stimulating these. When the child stops suckling on the breast, we don't have any neural stimuli to the hypothalamus, and so things just stop. All right? So that one's pretty easy, and it's an exception. It's a special case because it's positive feedback. So that one doesn't take really too much mental energy because it's so different than all the other ones. All right, now our other posterior pituitary hormone is antidiuretic hormone, which is a little more complicated, but the good thing is you know a little bit about it from 232. So this won't be the first time that you've heard of antidiuretic hormone. So it's produced by the other nuclei, the supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. It's transported via the tract as well, all right? And it's stored and released by the posterior pituitary. And again, I've written everything here. ADH is secreted up there in the supraoptic nucleus. Posterior pituitary stores it and eventually will release or secrete it. And then once it gets released into the bloodstream, it is going to go and impact a couple different parts of our body that we remember from 232. What is regulated by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus? So the hypothalamus is looking at osmoreception and is looking to see if there is a high solute concentration, low blood volume, or low blood pressure. If it sees those things, it wants to release ADH. Okay, so this is solute concentration in blood, by the way. So in blood. So it's looking at the blood solute concentration. So think of it this way. If we have a lot of solutes in our blood, and we have low blood volume, that means we have very concentrated blood and we don't have as much liquid, and we want that liquid back. And so remember, ADH's job is to it's antidiuretic, so it wants to bring water back for us and conserve water, which would decrease our solutes and increase our blood volume. That would also, because when blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up, it would do that. So if we see any of these three things, we get nervous that our blood volume and blood pressure is going to be too low, and we release ADH. Okay? Now, ADH targets are two places. It only lists this one, but there is two, and I put both of them up above here. So the kidney tubules and the collecting ducts, I guess we could put them both in, and collecting ducts. And that increases water reabsorption, right? We talked a little bit about that last term. We're going to talk about it more when we get to the kidney this term. So if we act on the kidney tubules and collecting ducts, we can actually make them more permeable to water, and water will return back to the blood. So that's important. Also, and I'm going to highlight it here because it's not written below, is remember it goes out to the peripheral vessels as well, and that causes vasoconstriction, and that increases blood pressure. That one's not listed on the notes below, but we learned that in 232. So actually, why don't we do this? We'll do this color-coded, make life a little easier for you. This one is not mentioned down below, so we'll do that. This one is mentioned down below in yellow, so we'll put that one there. Okay. And this does use, and I want to say one thing. So what it's doing is, if it's reabsorbing water at the kidney tubules and collecting ducts, this is going to prevent excessive urine production by removing the water, not from the urine per se. I want to change that term. It really is from the filtrate, which is what is right before urine, filtrate, okay, and returns it to the bloodstream, and that's really important. So this uses a negative feedback, sorry for the typo, negative feedback system, and so it's actually the opposite of these three things here. So if we now have lots of water, high blood volume, and low solute concentration, and our blood pressure is going up because we have high blood volume, then we can inhibit the hypothalamus and lower the neural impulses to the hypothalamus and then stop things. So this little thing here that I just did is right up here. Multiple sources of negative feedback, and there's those multiple sources right there. Low blood solutes, high blood volume, high blood pressure. All those things will tell the hypothalamus to stop secreting ADH because we have enough water back in our blood now. Our blood pressure is high enough. Our solute levels are low enough. Okay, so that's important. Now, there are two abnormalities that we should mention briefly: diabetes insipidus and increased hypersecretion of ADH. We're going to talk more about these later when we get into how we maintain water and, using our kidneys, but let's mention them. So diabetes insipidus doesn't have to do anything with diabetes mellitus, right, blood sugar ones, although it has a similar symptom, which might explain kind of the name similarity. So this is a hyposecretion of ADH, low levels of ADH secretion. And what that results in is excretion of large amounts of water in the urine, right? We normally want to keep the water in our body and not over-secrete water. But if we don't make enough ADH, then it just goes into the urine and we pee it out. And notice it can be a liter, from 1 to 2 liters a day, which is normally what you do, up to like 12. So 6 to 10 times the amount. This causes really increased thirst. You're constantly drinking water and then eliminating it, drinking water and eliminating. You're never satisfying. This is often due to trauma up in the hypothalamus or is some damage in the posterior pituitary. So it's not the most common thing. You can also oversecrete ADH. And if you oversecrete, that means you're going to bring too much water back and you're going to retain water. And what that will do is if we have too much water, that means we have low solutes, right? So low solutes, like low sodium, is called hyponatremia. And that can cause problems because remember, we need to have correct sodium levels for action potentials in our body, for example. So if we have too much water in our blood, that results in low sodium because we have so much water, it's diluting the amount of sodium we have. So just note those for now, and we will go in more detail about those when we get to fluid and electrolyte balance later in the term. All right, now we're going to move down. So we've now covered everything in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So we have all of those hormones that are being released there. We have all the releasing and inhibiting hormones, and we know they act on different organs like the thyroid, the gonads, the adrenal gland, etc. So now what we want to do is we want to cover those, we want to go down to those and look at how those hormones are released from those glands and how they impact the body. So that's what we're going to do next. All right, so we're going to start with the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is probably the most complicated one, so it's good to start there, and we'll work on that for this lecture. So the thyroid gland, you probably know where it is from your reading. By the way, this picture and both pictures are on page 617 of your book. I think I have them up right now on the book. Oop. There we go. Thyroid gland and a picture of the thyroid gland inside. And this is what you looked at in lab in week 1. So that should look somewhat familiar to you. Okay. So we will flick back here to our notes. So it's just below the larynx, and it sits on the anterior surface of the trachea. So you could physically palpate it if you kind of go to that area of the body. There is a right and left lobe connected by a mass of tissue called an isthmus. And so it's below the larynx, and it's on the anterior surface of the trachea. And it's got 2 lobes, and it's got this connection called an isthmus. And that isthmus is this little part right here that goes between the two, right there, all right? Just below the cricoid cartilage we talked about back in 231. And it has a very rich blood supply. It's going to be releasing hormones throughout the body, and so it has a lot of blood supply to take those hormones away. I'm not worried about the arteries themselves, but they come off the common carotid. Histologically, so here's our picture of the follicle of the thyroid gland, including lots of follicles, those spherical sacs you see there. And these guys right here, there's one. Okay, there's a bunch of them. All right, and they're filled with colloid. All right, and colloid, we'll talk about later, is the protein that's going to help, along with iodine, make T3 and T4. Okay, the cells that go around, if we zoom in, we can actually see this a little bit, are more of a cuboidal shape. So look right here, these cells that go around are kind of cuboidal. All right, and they're called follicular cells. I'm noticing we have a typo here. Let's fix that. We'll put it over here. Sorry about that. My notes are right. I don't know why this particular one is wrong. Follicular cells, all right, cuboidal, and they function to produce thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is the precursor. Whoop. Let me undo that. I just made a little error. Okay, let's try this again. Precursor to T3 and T4. Okay, so so those are going to produce the thyroglobulin that's going to mix with colloid, and we're going to end up making T3 and T4. The cells that don't reach the lumen are parafollicular cells, or C cells, and you can see some here. See how these cells right here, I'll circle them for you, are much lighter stained. Those are C cells, and they usually are in little groups and bundles that are away from the follicles. This particular picture doesn't have as many, but there's a couple right there you can see. All right, and those are the parafollicular cells, and those, interestingly, the parafollicular cells right there, those produce calcitonin, or thyrocalcitonin, and we're going to talk about that in a couple more pages when we get to calcium regulation. So we'll come back to that, but let's underline that because that's important. The parafollicular cells, or C cells, and they produce thyrocalcitonin, or just calcitonin. All right, so we mentioned T3 and T4. What are those? Well, T3 and T4 are the thyroid hormones themselves. Generally, T4 we say thyroxine. It is. You can also say it's longer, tetraiodothyronine, but I won't use that. T4. The tetra, though, does imply 4, so that does help a little bit. And the reason it's called T4 is because it contains 4 iodine atoms, and about 90% of all thyroid hormones are T4. And about 10% are T3, which is also triiodothyronine. Okay, so the tri tells you 3, and it has 3 iodine atoms. Now, an important point here is T3, these are both important points, so we'll start them both. T3 is much more potent of a hormone, and therefore 10 times active than T4. So even though it only shows up at 10%, it's 10 times more active. It binds more readily to the receptors than T4 does. T4 is secreted in a lot greater quantities. Like we said, it's like 90%. But many T4 molecules are actually converted to T3 at the target cells. So T4 is circulating a lot more in our blood, but once it gets to the target cells, we often convert it into T3 because it's more active. So that's kind of interesting. So what do these T3, T4 hormones do? And collectively, they're just called thyroid hormones. All right. So what they do is they increase rate of metabolism. We mentioned that already in a previous lecture, but they can increase metabolism, almost doubling it. And almost every body cell is going to be reacting to them. There are some exceptions of places where we want to just kind of have them work at a normal pace. So our brain is one. Testes and uterus are another one. Your spleen just kind of keeps working. We don't want to increase metabolism, have it destroy more blood cells, for example. Your lungs, same thing. And our retina, our eyes. So just kind of these various places where we don't want to increase metabolism. We just want to kind of have them work at a normal state all the time. Okay. Now, three principal effects of metabolism, and these are listed. I'm going to make so you know where the three are. One right there, two right here, and three right here. These are the three main things that these thyroid hormones do. Okay, so the first one, the first effect is to regulate metabolism, to increase it and decrease it. And so, what does that mean? Well, you might remember that any metabolism is either making things or breaking things down. So anabolism is building or binding, making small structures into larger structures. Where catabolism, think of cannibalism, that's the way I always remember it. Catabolism breaks things down. Cannibalism, unfortunately, breaks down humans. So an easy way to remember. Breaks down structures. So that when your cells of your body are building things, making things, or breaking things down, they're metabolizing. Okay? So another thing that happens here a lot is, and we'll just do another color just so it's clear, is we have a lot of protein synthesis. That's anabolism. We're making it, right? Actually, let's just say that there. So we want to have amino acids around to make proteins during metabolism. And we're going to also break down a lot of carbohydrate and lipids because we want to use that for fuel, right? Carbs and lipids are our two main sources of fuel. So if we increase the rate of catabolism of glucose and we do that with oxygen, guess what we're going to make? We're going to get a lot of ATP. If we get a lot of ATP, we're going to increase our basal metabolic rate. This week's lab is about basal metabolic rate, and thyroid hormones are going to regulate that. So the more thyroid hormones you release, you tend to increase your basal metabolic rate. When you increase your metabolism of your cells, they're breaking down and building all these things. Remember, we make a lot of heat, so your body heat goes up as well. So lots of things happen due to this thyroid hormones being released and increase in our body. And that little remember is just reminding you that when we break down glucose, or we could also substitute fats for that, in the presence of oxygen, we make lots of ATP. It says 38 there. It's a net of 36. We use 2 up over here, so you can change that to a 36 if you want for net. Actually, let's just write that in so we don't. 36 net ATP, so you don't get confused. Okay. So the more thyroid hormones, the more we're going to run this equation, the more ATP we're going to generate, and the more heat. We're going to use up a lot of our fuel, our glucose, and our fats. Okay. We'll come back and talk more about that a little later, probably. The second thing is regulation of growth and development. This works very hand in hand with growth hormone, especially in children. It works with growth hormone and insulin, because remember, insulin is going to bring sugars into our cells so we can then process them and run this equation up here. All right, so it's going to cause lots of body growth, skeletal system, the nervous system, everything. It's going to have overall maturation in general, and also increase reproductive capabilities like during puberty. Okay. The third thing that the thyroid hormones do is they maintain normal nervous system functioning. So they're really important in development of the nervous system in the fetal and newborn. And then they maintain it during our life. So when we release T3 and T4, we kind of make sure that the nervous system's working correctly. If we have hypothyroidism, low thyroid hormone levels during fetal development, we can get, unfortunately, less neurons and not the correct myelination because we don't have the development that we want, and as a result, we can have deficits like mental retardation. In childhood, if we have hypothyroidism, so the brain's already been developed here, but we have less neural issues because the brain's already been developed, but we would have small stature because our growth would be off, and we would have maldevelopment or not full development of many structures, including organs. So we want to identify patients that are hypothyroidism as soon as possible and try to treat them with thyroid hormones so these things won't happen. Okay? All right. I think we're actually going to stop there, and we are going to pick up next time on the synthesis and formation of T3, T4, because that takes a little bit of time, and then talk about some of the disorders as well. So I think this is a good time to stop, and we'll pick up next time. So relook at that, start to understand how important thyroid hormone is for working with growth hormone, for metabolism, and we're going to talk more about how we make those hormones, those thyroid hormones, in the next lecture. So, all right, thank you.